All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring an absolutely fascinating web of connections. We are going to look at how psychedelic substances create these massive ripples that move outward, starting from the deepest, most subjective corners of the human mind and extending all the way out to global forest conservation, human evolutionary theory, and the really rigorous frontiers of modern clinical research.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, essentially zooming from the micro right out to the macro. We'll kick things off by dissecting the anatomy of altered states. Then we'll see how spirituality ties into forest conservation. After that, we're going to objectively debunk the famous stoned ape theory. And finally, we'll wrap up by looking at a totally new era of institutional research.
So, starting off with charting the inner landscape. To truly wrap our heads around this topic, we first need to ground ourselves in the micro. What is actually happening in the human mind during a psychedelic state? For this, we're going to rely on a framework developed by the clinical psychiatrist Claudio Naranjo, who literally spent his career mapping out this incredibly complex inner world.
Take a look at this map. This brilliantly illustrates Naranjo's conceptual mapping of the psyche under the influence of LSD-like psychedelics. It shows us that these aren't just random, chaotic assortments of hallucinations, it's actually a highly structured dynamic. Notice model psychosis sitting right there in the center. From that point, the mind transitions through distinct states, moving along a vertical axis of birth and death and a horizontal axis that stretches from nothingness to being. The solid and dotted lines show how either letting go of control or resisting it physically drives a person through these different phenomenological realms.
Breaking down that diagram a bit further, Naranjo categorized these experiences into three primary psychospiritual zones. Way over on one end, you have heavenly states. These are characterized by oceanic bliss, the apprehension of intrinsic values, and just intense spiritual rapture. On the total opposite end are hellish states, which are basically a near-psychotic intensification of an individual's underlying psychopathology, and that's often triggered by resisting the experience. But nestled right between those extremes is something incredibly nuanced, the purgatory states.
Now here's what is absolutely fascinating about this purgatory state. You might assume people spend their trips entirely in heaven or hell, but Naranjo argues this is actually the most common emotional state experienced. It's a seeking state. It's half abundance and half deficiency. The individual isn't just passively soaking in bliss or cowering in terror, they're actively striving for purification. They're working through psychological obstructions and really pushing toward higher consciousness. It's essentially an engine for psychological growth.
Okay, let's scale up a bit and move from inward journeys to outward action. We're moving from the individual mind out to the community level. How do these profound internal purgatorial strivings and heavenly insights actually translate into the real world? Well, to see that, we have to look at some incredibly tangible ecological action happening right now in the Amazon.
2 million. Just let that sink in for a second. That staggering number represents the exact amount of trees planted over the last 20 years by the Ashaninka people of the Apituexa village, which sits on the banks of the Ammonia River in the Brazilian Amazon.
And to put that 2 million into perspective, this monumental carbon sequestering effort was pulled off by a community of merely 900 individuals. That is an absolutely astonishing per capita environmental impact. It really begs the question, what exactly is driving a community of just 900 people to mobilize at such an incredibly effective scale?
So what's their secret? The research points to a perfect synthesis of two worlds. On one side, you have their traditional ayahuasca-based spirituality. Here, metaphysical convictions, like considering plants as literal teachers, deeply inform their everyday behavior. But on the flip side, they are actively utilizing contemporary scientific practices in forest ecology. They aren't just relying on myth, they're marrying this deep spiritual reverence with hard ecological science. It's this reciprocal respect that proves indigenous peoples are often the most effective guardians of global biodiversity we have.
All right, zooming out even further to the human species as a whole. Fact versus fiction in evolutionary theory. We have to objectively address how psychedelics intersect with human evolution. And let's be honest, you really can't discuss that without tackling Terence McKenna's wildly popular, yet highly controversial, stoned ape theory.
If you follow this space, you definitely know the story. McKenna famously argued that low doses of psilocybin acted like chemical binoculars for early hominids out on the African savanna. His proposition was that eating these mushrooms increased their visual acuity, which made them better hunters. Better hunters obviously got more food, won more mates, bred more successfully, and boom, biologically drove the rapid expansion of the human brain. It's a hugely compelling story, right?
But here's the catch. Impartial analysis reveals a major factual error at the very foundation of this entire narrative. McKenna heavily cited a specific 1970 study by researchers Fisher and Hill to back up his chemical binoculars claim. However, when researcher Brian Akers actually contacted R.M. Hill directly to verify this, Hill explicitly confirmed his team never tested, let alone reported, an increase in visual acuity. In fact, he called McKenna's claim entirely spurious. The actual research pointed out that the disorientation caused by the drug might not be conducive to survival at all.
And it gets worse for the theory. Because even if we pretend the mushrooms did give them supervision, the biological logic completely collapses. McKenna's theory relies on a totally obsolete pre-Darwinian concept known as Lamarckian evolution. This is the mistaken assumption that a trait you acquire during your lifetime, like say a temporary visual boost from eating a fungus, can be directly genetically inherited by your offspring.
And that is exactly why the theory fails the hard science test. Biological evolution is driven by the transmission of genes across generations. Think about it. A hungry giraffe stretching its neck doesn't automatically produce longer-necked babies. In the same way, an ape eating a mushroom for a temporary visual boost provides absolutely no genetic toehold for gonchal selection to act upon. Without a specific gene mutating and being selected for, a dietary habit simply doesn't drive biological evolution.
Which brings us to our final section, bridging indigenous wisdom and modern clinical science. Let's step out of the evolutionary past and into the present day. Today, the rigorous truth about psychedelics is actively being separated from those old counterculture myths by leading scientific institutions across the globe.
Organizations like the Germany-based Psychedelia Foundation are building the infrastructure for this brand new era. They are assembling heavily credentialed, highly interdisciplinary boards. You have experts like Dr. Monica T. Williams, a top clinical psychologist focusing on mental health equity. You have Giorgio Samarini, a brilliant ethnobotanist studying the historical use of psychoactive plants. And you have Adriana D'Arienzo, an anesthesiologist and pain medicine specialist. It's a deeply multifaceted, serious approach.
Their whole mission purposefully moves us past the myths and the stigma. They are hyper-focused on promoting responsible education, robust clinical therapy, and rigorous research. But perhaps most importantly, they are actively working to integrate the very indigenous knowledge systems, like those we saw utilized so brilliantly by the Ashaninka people, with contemporary Western therapy. It's all about combining the best of both worlds.
So, what should you really take away from all this? From Naranjo's inner purgatories, to the massive conservation efforts in Amazonian forests, to modern medical boards, psychedelics represent a profound intersection of mind, culture, and science. As interdisciplinary science strips away the fictions to reveal their true therapeutic and ecological potential, it leaves us with a pretty massive question. Just how much of our own minds, and our deep connection to the world around us, do we still have yet to discover? Think about that for a while. Until next time.